All right, panelists, we are now live on both Facebook and Zoom, and you can switch your cameras on. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to our panelists. Welcome to folks at home who are joining us. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for tuning in. This is Understanding Bill C-70 Beyond a National Security State. I'm Bianca Majeni with Canada-China Focus, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. So today we're joined by Senator Yuen Pao-Wu, Professor Midori Ogasawara, Tim McSorley, National Coordinator at the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group. We'll also be hearing an introduction from Canada-China Focus board member, Professor John Price, who's going to be kicking off this critical discussion about why we should all be concerned and paying very, very close attention to the Countering Foreign Interference Act, which was recently rushed through Parliament. And for legislation with such far-reaching, significant implications, it has received remarkably little scrutiny. So all the more important to have this event today. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. Canada-China Focus is the host and organizer of today's event, and CCF aims to provide a space for conversations on critical issues that are related to Canada-China relations. And I've asked Rochelle, who's also joining us from CCF, to put those links in the chat to the website. This event is also sponsored by the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, and you can find out more about them at foreignpolicy.ca. So for my part, I'm based in Montreal, or Jojage, which is on the territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people, and who are the keepers of the eastern door of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And I want to thank folks again for joining us. This is such an important discussion. So speakers are going to give their remarks, and this will be followed by a discussion amongst speakers. And then in the time that remains, we'll be taking questions with the audience. So please do put your questions in the Q&A. As always, please keep your comments respectful. And there's lots to discuss, so let's get to it. To begin our event, we're going to hear from CCF board member John Price, Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Victoria and author of Orienting Canada, Race, Empire, and the Trans-Pacific. Welcome, John.
Thanks so much, Bianca. I'm speaking from the traditional and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Thank you so much to our panelists and to the many people attending this afternoon's event. I also want to acknowledge the support that Canada-China Focus has received from the Centre for Global Studies at the University of Victoria and from the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. We wouldn't be here without you supporting Canada-China Focus. Bill C-70, or the Countering Foreign Interference Act, received royal assent on June 20th this year. Our panelists tonight will delve into some of the details of that legislation and how we might deal with the impacts. I will be very brief and want to underline 2 points that might be relevant to tonight's topic. The first is that the passage of Bill C-70 and much else going on in this country point towards the emergence of a national security state in Canada. This term was first applied to the United States, and one researcher defined the national security state there this way: it channels all its efforts into meeting current and future military or security threats. The creation of the CIA, the Department of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the National Security Council at the onset of the Cold War gave impetus to a state mentality geared to permanent preparedness for war. The construction of threats is thus essential to its well-being, making intelligence agencies privileged tools in accomplishing this task. So my question is this not in fact what we are seeing happening today in Canada, with CSIS taking on an unprecedented public profile and now also being endowed with powers never before seen given to an intelligence agency in this country. I'm not going to dwell on this. I want to put it out there, but I want to get on to my second point. Despite the rather dire circumstances that we see today, there's also resistance. The coalition that began to coalesce in opposition to C-70, that Senator Wu and Tim McSorley were so instrumental in bringing together, was an important step in breaking down the isolation that is too often a hallmark of resistance. The movement in solidarity with Palestine is also bringing hope as people of every generation, of many faiths and of many communities persist in demanding an end to the slaughter of innocent Palestinians. So though we live in a moment of peril, the voices of resistance are coming together. And my hope for today's discussion is that it will further add to the momentum that is out there. And once again, I thank our panelists for taking the time to be with us today, and to all the people participating in the webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Thank you for that critical opening. Just laying out some of the base concerns that we have. I also want to let people know that John is one of the founders of CCF, which is a project of the University of Victoria's Center for Global Studies, as well as CFPI. And it's an organization that aims to provide a safe space for conversations on critical issues related to Canada-China relations. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Senator Yuen-Pao Wu, appointed to the Senate of Canada in November 2016. The Honorable Yuen-Pao Wu sits as an independent representing British Columbia. He's been the facilitator of the Independent Senators Group since 2017 and was re-elected for a second two-year term in December 2019. Senator Wu has worked on public policy issues related to Canada's relations with Asian countries for more than 30 years. From 2005 to 2014, he was president and CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, where he continues to serve as Distinguished East Asia Fellow. Welcome, Senator Wu.
Thank you, Bianca. Good afternoon to all of you, to my fellow panelists, to our viewers. I want to thank CCF, the CFPI, UVic, Center for Global Studies at University of Victoria, and all the others who have made this webinar possible. This is a timely discussion and a very important one, and one that requires a response not just from parliamentarians like myself, but from the broader Canadian society. We have to involve Canadian society more broadly, in part because the Parliament has, if I may be blunt, failed in its responsibility to properly scrutinize and review the Bill C-70 that we are now discussing. The first thing that has to be said about this bill is that it was rushed through the Parliament of Canada. It was rushed because of a climate of fear, I might even say hysteria, stoked by opportunistic politicians and self-serving media that made it very difficult for my colleagues to express any reservations or concerns they might have had with the bill. And hence we saw the bill get unanimous consent to be rushed through the House of Commons. We saw a hearings process that was essentially a validation of what the bill proposed, with relatively little space and time given to people who had concerns about the bill. When it came to the Senate, the situation was even more dire. My institution is supposed to be the place where there is sober second thought and where we are not captive to short-term political and popular and populist considerations, but we rushed it through the Senate even more quickly than the House of Commons. And just to underscore the timelines that are involved, in the case of the House of Commons, the bill received second reading on May the 29th. It passed the chamber on June the 13th. That's just under 2 weeks. And this is calendar time, not sitting time. Sitting time would be even less. In the Senate, we had first reading on June the 13th, and the bill was passed at third reading on June the 19th, all of 6 days. So the rushed nature of this bill exposes, I think, many of its flaws. And there are many to discuss, but I will touch on what I see to be some of the biggest flaws in parts 2 and part 4 of the bill. Let me start with part 4, which is on the creation of a Foreign Influence Transparency and Accountability Act or registry. This has been discussed for a long time. There are foreign agent registries in a number of other Western industrialized countries, and Canada is said to be late in coming to having a similar registry. I actually support having a registry that is an expanded version of the lobbyist registry, one which can capture individuals and groups that are on contract or have material arrangements with a foreign government to lobby the government. If you represent a foreign government and have some kind of arrangement that requires you to lobby public policy, you should have to register. But this registry goes beyond the requirements that the lobbyist registry would have in having a definition of requirement to register that is vague. What it says is that it ensures persons who, under an arrangement, carry out activities in relation to a political or government purpose in Canada have to register. And an arrangement is defined as one under which a person undertakes to carry out, under the direction of or in association with a foreign principal. I am okay with the term an arrangement with a foreign principal. And I understand that arrangements are not always just contractual arrangements. Sometimes they have to do with quid pro quos or quiet understandings between a government and their representatives. We should require individuals and organizations who have these kinds of arrangements, material arrangements, to register. But the term in association with is very problematic. It is not clear what this means, and I fear that the test of in association with will boil down to what your views are and who you associate with. That's in fact the term, in association with. And I hope everyone can understand that we have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms that protects the freedom of expression and the freedom of association, and that it should not be the case that someone has to register as a foreign agent or representative simply because their views align with a foreign principal, or simply because they have relationships with foreign principals. There's a lot more to be said about the registry, but let me move quickly to the other part of the bill, part 4, which underscores how problematic and dangerous the registry is because of the in association with clause. The different aspects to part 4, the good part of part 4, and I'll only touch on it very quickly, is the introduction of new criminal offenses that have to do with what's broadly called transnational repression. I've been an advocate of dealing with transnational repression through the criminal code rather than through proxy indicators such as a registry. I think the bill does a decent job in identifying new ways in which law enforcement can go after individuals who are acting on behalf of a foreign state to intimidate, to threat, to coerce, to bully Canadians. We should not tolerate that. And the first part of part 2 of C-70 introduces those new laws. But the second part of part 2 is very problematic, and it has to do with laws that counter political foreign interference in a political process on behalf of a foreign entity. Now, let me be clear. It is not illegal to participate in a political process in Canada on behalf of a foreign entity. The law does not make that illegal. It only makes it illegal if you're doing it surreptitiously, secretly, or deceptively. But the ability for the law enforcement to identify someone who is participating in a political activity on behalf of a foreign entity surreptitiously or deceptively is by determining if they have an arrangement with a foreign entity or are in association with a foreign entity, which means that Canadians who want to get involved in Canadian democracy, nomination campaign, elections, school board even, or any kind of public policy discussion, any Canadian who wants to get involved in that kind of activity and has innocuous ties with a foreign entity could be deemed in violation of the law and subject to criminal penalties under those new provisions in C-70. And get this, the maximum penalty for participating in Canadian democracy surreptitiously or deceptively on behalf of a foreign entity because you were deemed in association with, the maximum penalty is life imprisonment. I can only conclude that we will have to wait to see how the commissioner defines an association with. But the term is there in the law. Parliamentarians had the chance to remove that language from the law. I moved an amendment in the Senate to get rid of those 3 words. It was defeated in the Senate, so we lost that opportunity. And now it will be up to the commissioner to define how that's used. But any definition that is expansive could well capture and snare Canadians who want to get involved in Canadian democracy, but who may be tagged as foreign agents. And they will run the risk of life imprisonment. What this will do then is that it will suppress participation in Canada's democracy, particularly among immigrants and among Canadians who have ties abroad. And that surely is contrary to the very purpose of C-70. Let me stop there, Bianca, and pass it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Senator Wu. Thanks for your leadership on this as well, and for today digging deep with us into this bill. Your nuanced scrutiny, particularly the vague language and in association clause, and the penalties, and the chilling effect that I imagine will be accompanied by those wishing to, as you mentioned, participate in Canadian democracy. So I look very forward to hearing more from you in the discussion and Q&A. Just a quick note to our audience that we will be rebroadcasting this discussion to YouTube. So please do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Rochelle has put that information in the chat. Also a reminder for you to place your questions in the Q&A box for the session we'll be having later. So next, we'll be hearing from Tim McSorley. Tim McSorley joined the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group as the coalition's national coordinator in November 2016. Previously, Tim was the coordinator for the Media Co-op Independent Media Network and the Dominion magazine. He also served as coordinator for Voix Coalition, defending the right to dissent and protecting democratic rights in Canada. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks so much, Bianca. It's great to be here. Thanks to you and everyone at CCF, and really great to be here with Senator Wu and Midori and Professor Price. It's really great to have the opportunity to share the work that we've been doing, and I'm very cognizant and appreciative of the work that all of you have done to shed a light on Bill C-70 and these concerns that we have around issues of the government's response to foreign interference. I'd like to start just by saying a little bit about the organization I work for. The International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group is a coalition of 46 Canadian organizations. We started in 2002 as a response to the government's adoption of the first Anti-Terrorism Act in 2001. And what we saw at the time as being, again, a piece of national security legislation being rushed through Parliament, very little room for debate in a context of nationalism, of xenophobia, of fear, the need to think about how we protect the security of people, but that the rush to bring about these security laws, as Professor Price was saying, the idea of a security state of responding to things so quickly by expanding and relying on national security agencies was very concerning at the time. Very worrisome, and it was seen by multiple groups in civil society in Canada that there wasn't one organization working at that time that really was specializing in looking at anti-terrorism and civil liberties issues, and so that led to the founding in 2002 of the ICLMG. So our focus hasn't been necessarily on foreign interference as such in our work. And so we watched with concern around some of the initial developments and ways the government was reacting to accusations of foreign interference, and saw some parallels around the work that we had done around the war on terror, so-called war on terror and anti-terrorism laws. I want to just say that one of those parallels was that we had seen in very real ways how governments transnationally or domestically intimidate, as Senator Wu was saying, intimidate, harass, imprison human rights defenders, critics of their governments. And we've always supported the idea that the Canadian government needs to protect and act on those issues to protect human rights and protect civil liberties, but to do so in a way that doesn't also serve to undermine those same civil liberties and human rights. And to do so, again, as Senator Wu was saying, through the criminal code. And one of our primary arguments and concerns with the Anti-Terrorism Act and anti-terrorism laws in Canada is that it builds this exception around around the idea of crimes that may be politically motivated, but that really brings in this ambiguity around who they're applied to. And that's what we've seen with anti-terrorism laws in terms of, for example, studies that have shown 98% of those in Canada who have been charged with anti-terrorism laws, under anti-terrorism laws, are Muslim men. And so this has been a key component of our work, and we see a lot of parallels with how we've seen the response from the government to foreign interference, and that's why we start paying more attention to it through our coalition as well. One of the areas, before I get into the legislation, one of the areas that we saw that was around these questions of secrecy and transparency and of leaks. And there was a very worrisome parallel to the early 2000s where there were cases of leaks to journalists, of leaks to politicians who then spoke without citing their sources, with very serious accusations against people in Canada and Canadians that led to serious impacts on their lives, including some who were eventually Maher, who was renditioned and tortured, to others who were illegally arrested in other countries, including Abdul al-Malki and others who faced imprisonment and torture, based on information that later was proven to be false, or that security officials had promised journalists that they would provide them with evidence later on about the involvement of these men in terrorism, and that evidence didn't exist. we're lucky actually with some journalists we've spoken to, and this is to the credit that there's a lot of journalists who don't go for that, and that we spoke with journalists who are offered these exclusive stories, but without being provided the evidence, and they refuse to run them. Unfortunately, there are also times where the stories are run and they cause irreparable harm, and we've seen similar concerns come out in the discussions and issues around foreign interference. One of the issues we've been looking at, and we'll be on a panel in Montreal next week, is around the Montreal community centers and Chinese community centers in Montreal that face serious allegations of being Chinese police branches. And yet now we're told that all of those have been shut down, but these organizations still are under investigation, but there's no development, no further information about anything they've done wrong, but they're stuck under this cloud of accusation, and it's had serious impacts. So that's one way that we've seen the parallel. The other way is that is what we've seen in terms of the powers, and I'll try to summarize a little bit of some of the concerns we've seen in terms of the powers and changes that Bill C-70 have brought around. I won't belabor the point. Senator Wu made a very good point about how it was rushed. I was going to speak about that, but I don't think we need to say much more. I'll just add that it made it incredibly difficult for civil society organizations to do their work, to be able to do research, to prepare briefs, to get them to committees. It might not be apparent, but it takes weeks, if not months, for those briefs to be written. And then once they're submitted to committee, they have to be translated before they can even be officially submitted, which itself takes its own time. And so the fact that even some briefs, we're very grateful to the work of parliamentary staff that they were able to translate some and get them in front of senators and MPs. But it was a very challenging, very limited process. And something that for the scope of Bill C-70, it's completely unacceptable. And something that we rarely, if ever, have seen, apart from, I'd say, the original Bill C-36, the first Anti-Terrorism Act, and in some degrees, Bill C-51, the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2015. I wanted to touch on, in terms of the bill itself, two parts of the bill. One being the part one, which is the changes to the CSIS Act. And then part three, which is way sensitive information is handled, but primarily changes to the Canada Evidence Act. It's a vast bill, so I'm also trying to I've tried to decide on what some of the most important parts are to highlight. One thing with CSIS I'd like to highlight, and that I think encapsulates some other parts of the bill as well, is that we saw Bill C-70 bring in powers that aren't directly related to foreign interference. They're powers and changes that we've actually seen security agencies arguing for in other pieces of legislation that didn't move forward, or proposals that never became legislation, and that may have an impact on investigating foreign interference, but aren't necessarily related to it. And that was a big concern to us. So for example, in changes to the CSIS Act, there were changes made to the CSIS dataset regime, which is how CSIS, since 2019, has been able to collect vast data sets of information and analyze them in order to identify intelligence priorities and threats to Canada. That in itself was very controversial and remains controversial at the time because of the amount of information that's collected, what it means for privacy rights, and what it means for how CSIS is using data analytics, and what kind of algorithms are being used, who's being identified as a threat. But the changes to the powers of the dataset regime followed a very scathing report from NCIRA, the National Security Intelligence Review Agency, that essentially called out CSIS for going beyond the scope of the dataset regime. And yet Bill C-70 brought in changes to essentially allow CSIS and justify CSIS going outside the scope retroactively. And we've seen this before. And up until the point of this bill, foreign interference had never been mentioned in terms of arguing for the dataset powers. And it's clear that access to this kind of information could help to identify threats of foreign interference. But overall, it's a justification for a power that was never developed and never argued for in terms of foreign interference in the first place. Another area that CSIS was granted new powers or expanded powers that have been previously argued for is changes to its warranting powers. So CSIS has a very strict or had a very strict warrant process, but it was an onerous process, one that CSIS had complained about, and one that independent reviewers had found that CSIS derided and saw it as a necessary evil and didn't want to necessarily follow the warranting process. And through that, even misled the courts in applying for warrants by withholding information, by sharing information they knew to be illegally and unlawfully gathered, in order to simplify the process. And again, instead of seeing a clear solution to that, we see CSIS given expanded warranting powers that facilitate them being able to seek out warrants to be able to search individuals and their personal electronic devices, for example, or to be able to conduct surveillance overseas, but from within Canada. So we're concerned that these kinds of powers that were previously argued for example, in the original proposal for the Online Harms Act before the Bill C-63 was introduced last spring, in 2021, this was part of that package, but it was so criticized as not being related to online harms that it was removed, but from the eventual legislation. But now we see it included in Bill C-70. Finally, on CSIS, a big part of the discussion around foreign interference has been how can the government properly disclose information around foreign interference, both to those who are making decisions around policy and also those who are facing threats. And we think this is a really important conversation and something that needs a solution. Unfortunately, we're concerned about the solution that was in Bill C-70, because the solution is to expand CSIS's ability to share information under different degrees of information under different processes. So for example, private information can be shared more broadly now with the approval of the minister. But then on top of that, more general information can be shared with civil society organizations, individuals who face threats. And our concern isn't so much that this information is being shared, but rather that CSIS has a history of politicizing how and what information they share. And so we're concerned that this is being managed through a security agency and not perhaps through another body that is less intent on identifying security threats, but rather on upholding democratic values and things like that. And it's not to say that individuals at CSIS aren't doing that and that, you know, it's more of a systemic issue that we see security agencies, their mandate is to look for threats and to share this information based on threats. And what we've seen in the past is that, for example, CSIS has been involved with information sharing around threats to natural resource development in Canada. But some of those conversations are around Indigenous peoples protesting the building of pipelines and resource extraction on their lands, which is legitimate. But it's being shared in behind closed doors with private corporations, with CSIS present and with the RCMP present, and without any information being shared with the Indigenous land defenders who are standing up and protecting their land and pushing back and their allies. And so it's a very one-sided process. And we're concerned that this may exacerbate the one-sided process without more rules around what kind of information is shared, how it's shared, any kind of record keeping around what information is being shared and about who. And so we think that there needs to be a serious rethink around how this is carried out. The last thing that I want to touch on is part 3 of the Act, around the changes to the Canada Evidence Act. And this is this part in particular didn't receive a lot of scrutiny, and we think deserves it. But it's a little difficult to parse. But at the heart of it, since the establishment of a lot of Canada's anti-terrorism laws, there's been a growing use of secret evidence and secret information and in the courts. So for example, if we look at the security certificate regime under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, there's provisions to be allowed for the government to share information in secret with judges regarding the individual who's being placed under security certificate and facing deportation from Canada, that individual is not able to access. This has been litigated It was found eventually constitutional. We still have major concerns around the constitutionality of this process, and there's still individuals who are stuck under the security certificates without the prospect of achieving justice. But beyond that, there's other administrative tools to counter terrorism that have integrated similar approaches to withholding evidence. So the terrorist entities list, the passenger protect program, or the no-fly list, rules around charities, and the newly established bill C-41 system for approving and authorizing not humanitarian aid, but international assistance to areas that may be controlled by a terrorist organization. And so what the changes to the Canada Evidence Act does is takes all of these kind of disparate regimes that basically say and set out the rules for when a judge can refuse the disclosure of sensitive information that's sensitive for national security reasons or national defense reason or even international affairs reasons, and that they can rule that the government does not need to disclose those to the defense, but that they can still be considered in deciding whether or not these individuals can be listed or denied or things like that. And it takes them all and essentially creates a standardized system across for all administrative proceedings and appeals proceedings arising from those administrative proceedings. It doesn't touch the criminal code, but sets this up so that there's a standard process across the system, which is okay, which on one hand is a good idea because it provides clarity for defendants in terms of how this will proceed. But on the other hand, it also simplifies the process so that now instead of when we're bringing in new pieces of legislation that the government needs to explicitly say, okay, for this piece of legislation, we're going to allow the courts to explicitly refuse the disclosure of the information on these grounds, they can now refer just back to these sections of the Canada Evidence Act. And we're concerned that this normalizes the process and will eventually allow for the expanding of this process. And we actually saw this, just to end on, in a very small way, that the security certificate system that I mentioned in large part is excluded, they said is excluded from this new standardized process. The process that's built into that law, into ERPA, stays the same. Except they're now expanding the kinds of information that can be withheld from those accused under security certificates to go beyond simple national security issues, but to include national defense and international affairs. So again, we see that in bringing in this standardized process, it also facilitates the expansion of the process. And I think that this is going to raise serious concerns, and that we're only going to know what the problems are once it affects people and they have to go through the course to challenge it. And I think I went a little long, but thanks for giving me that space, Bianca. And I hope this has been valuable information for everyone. And I'm looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have later on. Thanks.
Very, very valuable. I'm also looking forward to hearing more from you, Tim, in the Q&A period. And just want to thank you for taking us through many aspects of this legislation so expertly, and also great to understand some of the relationships to past problematic bills. It is so alarming to hear about these major changes, the expansion and scope of national security powers, the problematic process, the impact that the rushing had on civil society's ability to participate, to respond, to engage, and also the background that these agencies have been trying to acquire these powers for many years. So we'll talk more about all of this in the Q&A and discussion. You can find out about Tim's important work at iclmg.ca. So we're now moving on to our next esteemed panelist, Professor Midori Ogasawara, who is currently professor in the sociology department at the University of Victoria. She has worked as a staff writer for Japan's national newspaper, the Asahi Shimbun, and was engaged in investigative journalism on surveillance technologies, Japan's sex slavery during the Second World War, and US bases in Okinawa. Welcome, Professor Midori Ogasawara.
Thank you, Bianca. Thank you for including me to this panel. I had been I have been very concerned about the bill C-70. I guess since the time the CSIS started the campaign about the so-called China's the interference to the Canada's national election. I have been closely looking at their information, what the CSIS disclose and then don't disclose. And I was always like a puzzle, like, where is the evidence of the foreign interference? And then it's been a year and a half since then because they started kind of public campaign last year in February. But there are many reports by now. The Senator Wu published also the wonderful piece, the article called On Familiar Spirit I have here. And you said that there are the full official reports about the China's so-called the Foreign Interference Act, but then probably I'd like to ask you a question about that. But basically, it's really difficult to have the open conversation about this because as a public, part of the public, we don't have the clear information about it. And then that's a CSIS the discretion always, how much they disclose the data or the information. And because I'm the surveillance researcher, I've been looking at how the different the government has been using surveillance technologies to watch over the world population, essentially, especially after during the war on terror. And then also I've been looking at the Canada's legislation, how the Canadian government has been pushing the boundary of the legal and then illegal surveillance activity by the intelligence agency and then police agency. And then in the last 20 years, unfortunately, I have to say the Canadian government has been expanding the power of the surveilling the people in Canada, basically. So I published an article called Legalizing Illegal Mass Surveillance, and then I talk a little bit about my interview with Edward Snowden. And then Edward Snowden is the whistleblower from the American National Security Agency, and then he disclosed to the public how wide, how gigantic network of surveillance, electronic surveillance the American government established during the wartime, during the war on terror. So under that regime, Canada, as a part of the Five Eye countries, Five Eye countries referred to the United States, UK, Canada, Australia, and then New Zealand, how United States also pushing this legal boundary of the mass surveillance activities, and then in other countries, and then they often use the term of the harmonization. They trying to harmonize the standard of the legalizing previously illegal mass surveillance activities in that country. So Snowden disclosed the Japanese case in my interview. So since then, I got that perspective, especially in the among the Five Eye countries, how they make the surveillance system resemble to each other, and then incorporate the American surveillance network. Incorporate each system into the American, worldwide surveillance system. So I would situate this Bill C-70, now the Countering Foreign Interference Act, is part of this move of the legalizing illegal mass surveillance here in Canada. And then as the Senator Wu referred, Australia, America, the United States, and then Australia, they have the UK as well, they have the very similar system of the foreign registry. And so the mainstream media can say, oh, Canada is behind, we have to catch up, you have to modernize the tool of the surveillance, you have to give the proper tool to CSIS, and then they always push this type of campaign. And we've seen that already during the war on terror era, but there is another really radical step forward to legalize the illegal mass surveillance system. So I like to a bit, because I'm a surveillance researcher, I like to step back a little bit because to say to tell the meaning and then also the social consequences of the registry, because registry, foreign registry system, just registration or just give your personal data, register with the government. Many people would think it's nothing, it's just a neutral system, give the name, we do this everyday life, you give your name or photo, upload to the social media, maybe it's not the big deal. Some people may think, it's just objective, the way to have the to give the data. However, there is a historical pattern how government has been abusing the power by using the personal data registered with them. There is historical patterns in this country as well. And then I like to start with the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1923. Under this law, the Chinese Canadians, people in Canada who has the Chinese ancestry, they are required to register. And there is a historical records, how much it's a really fearful system for them. It's just probably, in some people's eyes, it's just to give the pieces of the personal information. But that means government can locate you anytime, what you are doing there, who you are communicating with. And so just the personal information can actually open up all the monitoring system to the next stage. So registration is not just a neutral thing. It always set with the identification and then also the tracking, the monitoring always comes with the registration system. And during the wartime, the World War II in Canada, the government also started the wartime registration system. All the people in Canada are basically required to register. And then some people don't want it to be registered with the government. And then those people cannot receive the social assistance or any public support by the governments. So any people who are trying to avoid the registration, then they will get the disadvantage and then as well. Also, another example, Japanese Canadians during the Second World War, they are also required to register with the government. And then it was not only about their the personal information, including their properties, personal belongings, and then all these registration data are used to sell these people's properties during the wartime. And then also the Japanese Canadian people were interned to the interior BC, not only the BC, but the Alberta, Saskatchewan, they were spread to they were forced to spread in Canada. So they originally, most of them lived in the west coast of Canada, but they are removed based on that data registered with the government. And then Indigenous people, it's probably the longest history in Canada who needed to give the their data, as well as they are placed under the very the severe surveillance by the government. Reservation system, residential school system, both definitely require the data about the Indigenous people. And then their movement were restricted based on the pass system since the late 19th century toward the beginning of the 20th century. So registration is not just a neutral observation. It is the government to intervene the personal lives of these the vulnerable the communities. So I have to say, after looking at these historical patterns, the racialized communities are often the target of the state surveillance. And then it's not a coincidence. CSIS, the intelligence agency, often target these racialized and vulnerable communities as the threat of the country. So these population, I'm very deeply concerned. You know, these population can continue to be the targets by the intelligence agency as the national security threat. However, at the same time, these category of the people as the threat to a risk are very slippery. It can always expand toward the general population. And every crisis or the national security the issue can expand the area of the surveillance as well as the population, the target, the population subject to surveillance. So some people may think, oh, this is only about the Chinese Canadian people or the people, you know, from other countries. So it's nothing to do with me. No, not really, because we all are under the mass surveillance since the war on terror. The same thing. We may think, you know, this is just the small system. However, this system can expand anytime toward any kinds of the people once the intelligence agency define those people are the threat or risks to this country. So these are the most concerning parts to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Ogasawara. Really, really important to hear from you and to understand more clearly and deeply the role of surveillance in the foreign registry, particularly the impact on marginalized communities. I really do feel like you've helped us to understand in particular the seriousness of a registry, right? And the historical cases too, I think, are very important. So I just want to take a moment before we move into our discussion period to let you know that CCF has another event next week called 100% Tariffs on China's EVs. Is this Canada's just transition? And we'll be joined by Elizabeth May, co-leader of the Green Party, and author Sam Gindin, also former research head of the Canadian Auto Workers Union, and they're going to be discussing the Liberal government's recent imposition of a 100% tariff on Chinese-made electric vehicles. So if you're interested in finding out what's at stake in this move, please do join us on September 19th, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Also, we're now on Twitter, so please do follow us there for news, analysis, and upcoming events. And also, if you go to our website, you can find out how to get our newsletter as well, an excellent newsletter that comes out twice a month. So that concludes our presentations. Thank you so much to our panelists. We're now moving on to the discussion portion of the evening and of the afternoon rather. And the first question I have for all panelists is, I'm curious to know whether anything came up for you as you listened to the presentations. Yeah.
Well, if I could start, I really enjoyed and learned a lot from Mr. McSorley and Professor Ogasawara. From Tim, you know, I hadn't fully understood how opportunistic C-70 was in that the government, with really the connivance and support of all of the opposition, inserted certain provisions, new laws that are only at best tangentially related to foreign interference, but which have been, I guess, priorities for our intelligence agencies. And this is another example of how Parliament dropped the ball, because this is what parliamentarians should be observing and pointing out as part of our job of scrutinizing legislation, and we quite simply failed to do that. Dr. Ogasawara's historical perspective is extremely important. She reminds us of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which of course was directed only at Chinese people. And, you know, it should be obvious from what she said, but because only Chinese people and all Chinese people had to register between 1923 and 1947, the authorities could come up to any Chinese person at any time and demand proof of having registered, and not registering or not being able to demonstrate that you are exactly what the document says could subject you to fines, to prison, or to deportation. And what I want to say is that, there's a bit of a debate today. It's the 100th anniversary, right, of the Chinese Exclusion Act, 101 years now since it was implemented. And I have been saying to Canadians that we must be careful about modern exclusion. We had Chinese exclusion 100 years ago, and we probably will never have that same kind of exclusion, that same kind of racism, because societies evolve. But society's ability, human nature, the ability of humans to come up with ever new creative and insidious ways of exercising racism and prejudice and discrimination is a marvel. It's a sad marvel. And I really worry that we are approaching a new form of exclusion. It's in the first instance directed at Chinese, not at all Chinese, but at the idea that there are some good Chinese and there are some bad Chinese. And the way in which modern exclusion is going to determine whether you're a good Chinese Canadian or a bad Chinese Canadian is based on your views and based on who you associate with. And that is a fundamental affront to our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but not many people see that.
Thank you, Senator. Other thoughts?
I like to respond to Senator Wu. Is that okay? Yeah. Oh,
Yes.
thank you for commenting on that. I think that the good Chinese or good bad Chinese or good citizens or bad citizen, that itself is the function of surveillance. Self-surveillance. People started to surveil themselves. In the eye of government or CSIS. It doesn't really have to be the government. I think it's the eye of the spy agencies. Am I look okay? Like what I'm doing on the social media or on the street, is that safe enough? And then it caused like a whole chilling effect, for sure. Yes. So it's not democratic. And then the team referred to the secret evidence and then the secret court. These should be the really rare case or an exception. Exceptional case in the democratic government. However, it's been expanding so much. And then I would say that secret evidence is not evidence. Secret court is not court either. It should be like open to the public. And then so the whole conversation about the Bill C-70 always carry that same issue in that sense. I would like to ask actually the Senator Wu. So here are like a full official report about the foreign interference activities by now, but are they written in the clear language? There is no like a deduction or how clearly they identify the evidence. And then I have one more question. So just let me say. So it's called a registry, but no one will just, come forth and then say, hey, I'm the spy, I'm doing, foreign interference here. Then how CSIS can register those people? That's a fundamental contradiction to me. If you can respond, I would appreciate.
Shall we let Tim come in first, Bianca, if he had anything to comment? I'm happy to respond to
Your
Dr. Gasu.
preference, Senator Wu? Yes, go ahead.
Shall I go ahead? Okay, just quickly then. One of the big challenges in all of the reports that have come out, the David Johnston report, the initial report of the commissioner, the NCIRA report, the NCCOP report, is that all of them are taking the so-called intelligence from CSIS and CSE and others, not sharing very much in the report, but I sense that they're taking it all at face value. And when I look at the specific question of the so-called evidence of interference in GE44, the 2021 general election, there are two that stand out. You know, it's repeated all the time. One is the foreign interference against Kenny Chiu, a Richmond MP candidate, and the other one is the interference against Erin O'Toole, the leader of the Conservative Party. But when I look at the evidence, it's totally insubstantial and unsupported. In fact, the intelligence doesn't even say that it was foreign interference. What it says is that we cannot determine whether it was foreign interference. And so I worry, my general worry is that all of these reports are not applying a critical eye to what the intelligence agencies are telling us. They are taking them at face value. And they are doing so in part, I think, because the immense political pressure on them and on the Canadian political class to find serious problems of foreign interference in our country. And don't get me wrong, if we need to find if there are serious problems of foreign interference. But there's another risk, and I think that's a greater risk today, which is an overreaction to exaggerated or false or spurious claims of foreign interference that harm the fundamental rights of Canadians. And let me just say one more thing, because you talked about the EV session that you're having next week. This is a really interesting question. Your panelists are not going to be tagged as foreign agents. They're powerful people, no worry about that. But you know, what if some ordinary Canadian, a Canadian who happens to be maybe an immigrant from China, goes public and says, you know, we really should not have tariffs on Chinese EVs because they are good cars and they will help reduce emissions, blah, blah, blah. Doesn't matter what the arguments are. Suppose they come out and say that, and they have ties with China. They grew up in China, maybe they drive an EV in China. Will they have to register? Will somebody in the community say, oh, this guy is arguing in favor of Chinese companies, and that person has ties with Chinese organizations? Why isn't he registering? And if that person then doesn't register because he feels that he's just expressing an opinion, if that person then gets involved in a political process, let's say he runs for a school board where his kids go to school, and the RCMP decides that he is participating in a political process surreptitiously or deceptively because he did not register in the foreign agent registry. What's going to happen to him? Maximum penalty of life imprisonment. Who's going to want to be involved? Who's going to want to speak out on public policy issues? Let me stop there.
It sounds like a trap. All right, Professor Price, Tim.
Yeah, I'd love to just make a couple comments. You know, I think that last point that you made, Senator Wu, is very important, and I think that's going to be the big question around how these foreign interference laws are applied, and that's the suspicion and the level of scrutiny. And I think, you know, Midori, that what you raised around how this fits into a larger question of global surveillance and surveillance activities by the government. You know, people don't think of a registry as surveillance, but I think that, you know, your point is an incredibly important one, and one that needs to be remembered, is that this is how governments surveil. It's by collecting information about individuals and forcing them to register. And we can be told, you know, we've been told, you know, often that it'll be a benign registry. If you register, doesn't mean it's an influence registry. It doesn't mean that you are interfering or that you've done anything wrong. It's just for clarity, similar to the Lobbying Act. And that brings me to, I think, you know, one of the most a key thing that you mentioned, Senator Wu, was that there are other proposals that we could be looking at, and that simply weren't considered because it was rushed, including expansion of the Lobbying Act, which is an understood process that has clear limitations, and yet that wasn't even considered and couldn't be considered because of the rushed process. But just to go back to what you were saying, Midori, about issues around surveillance and those questions, and the information that's collected either through the registry or that will be collected in order to facilitate the investigation of these new foreign interference crimes raises serious concerns around the breadth of new surveillance tools and information that will be gathered, and what will be shared with foreign partners as well. And I think that's why also what you're saying about the global surveillance system is so important. Something I didn't mention was part of the new disclosure powers that CSIS has is that they will be able to disclose data sets to foreign partners, and that under the terms of the changes to Section 19 of the CSIS Act that deal with disclosure of information, it broadens it so that the information, with the approval of the minister, isn't limited to being shared with other Canadian departments, but also could be shared with anyone. And that includes foreign entities. And so the concern is that we're going to see the information collected under the investigation of these new crimes. So let alone just the prosecution and the impact of these new laws themselves, but that the information collected in terms of investigating and whether or not a crime has been committed will be able to be collected and shared more easily, not just within Canada, but internationally. And that raises, serious concerns. And what we didn't see, because having those laws there is bad enough, but what we didn't see is the implementation of any restrictions or any disclosure, any reporting. Other pieces of legislation around information sharing require very strict record keeping about why the information was shared with whom, and that if the receiving agency has information, realizes that they don't need it, that they need to destroy it and return it to CSIS or the disclosing agency. We see nothing like that in Bill C-70. And so, I think it's so important, this question of surveillance, and I hope that gets more out there as we discuss, the impacts and how to push back against, how these laws are going to be implemented.
Thank you, Tim. John.
Thanks very much, Bianca, and thank you, all of the panelists for great presentations. I wanted to raise a couple of questions that haven't really been focused on much, and that is even though the language of much of the legislation is neutral, it talks about foreign entities, etc. We know for a fact that the focus has been on China. And sometimes perhaps on Iran or occasionally Russia. But, how do we deal with this supposedly neutral language when we know that countries such as the United States are actively interfering in Canadian affairs? And people like Gordon Laxer have talked about foreign-funded oil companies and what they're doing. We also know that, for example, foreign companies are well represented in the Business Council of Canada. And the Business Council of Canada has been one of the most active lobbyers to reinforce the powers of CSIS. And they have relied, for instance, TC Energy, the president of TC Energy, is on the subcommittee of the Business Council that is looking at national security. And that subcommittee is co-chaired by the head of MasterCard Canada. These are, entities that are closely tied to foreign corporations, foreign oil companies as well. And they have been behind the lobbying. And we know that TC Energy, for example, is relying on geopolitical information provided from their Washington office by operatives who were 2 out of 3 employed by the Trump administration in the past. So how can this not be construed as foreign interference? And others, and in the chat it's being raised, what about in cases such as Israel, that has clearly been interfering in Canadian affairs for a long time through things like the National Fund, the Jewish National Fund, and other funds that have in fact received charitable status? So these questions, how do we broaden the discussion to get away from what they want us to look at and to look at some of the underlying issues.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John. Unless anyone has a direct response to John's comments, I think we are going to move into the Q&A for the remaining period of time that we have. Is there anything else on your minds, panelists, before we move on? Okay, wonderful. Okay, so we have quite a few questions. I'm going to try and group them together. The first group actually sort of addresses what John had touched upon, but perhaps we can broaden this discussion out a bit since there are so many questions about it in the chat. So Feroz asks, could the panel discuss the role of the Jewish National Fund and similar institutions, which funds illegal settlements in Palestine, the likelihood of pro-Israel funders being subject to the provisions of the bill, foreign influence on Canada's election, etc. Are these organizations required to register? And then John, also in the chat, says, would anyone care to comment on the US, Ukraine, or Israel in the context of C-70? And Satoko in the chat, in the Q&A box, addresses foreign interference and CSIS and says Five Eyes countries, as Midori had stated, coordinate their surveillance systems. So should CSIS register themselves first? So continuing on from the discussion that John had started, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts, panelists. Could we start with you, Dr. Ogasawara?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a strong punchline. The CSIS should register themselves with the foreign interference entity. Yeah, I agree with that. Yes. So although the law is written in the universal language, practice is different. It's always, have the certain targets, the response to the political climate. So right now, the CSIS is seeing China as the major threat, potential threat, right? And then, this is because the United States has been raising the tension and then the folding diplomatic relation with the People's Republic of China. So then all the technological hegemony, the United States has been championing since the World War II. And then they feel now they are threatened because China is kind of outside of the control of their mass surveillance network. And then, of course, it's not only China, other countries as well. And then this is, the things always happen. And of course, not everything under the American control. However, to them, it feels a threat. So that is why they're trying to justify it and bring the data information to convince the public, basically, why these the countries are the potential threat or the enemies, potential enemies to our country. So that's the practice based on the data, always depend on the political climate. That is why the system seems small at the moment, but it can expand anytime. And then the surveillance elevate always to the next level in the time of crisis. You can see that example clearly in the time of pandemic. And then also the war on terror, the Muslim people disproportionately, there is no proportionate level. However, they are disproportionately targeted by CSIS. And then there are the clear human rights violation issues a lot. And we haven't really fixed it. And then even before the Hague Committee's final report, CSIS was so inclined to push this, push it through the parliament. So I think it's really nice to hear the Senator Wu, as a part of the Canada's parliamentary system, someone in the parliament feel the responsibility and try to closely, look at the legislation. And then that is the function. And it should be the supreme level of the discussion, deliberate discussion about the legislation, right? That's the parliament, the role of the parliament. However, how fast it was pushed through, yeah, can tell. Always this type of the national security legislation is it's not democratic in process, in practice either. So that's something I like to respond to the questions, and then as well as the John's point, there are many actors. It's not only like a Chinese or any the foreign governments. Actually, within the democratic system of Canada, there are many interference, right? Like a democratic system, the people wants to like, for example, public relations by the oil companies, and then the manipulation of the data, false data, misinformation, disinformation, all kinds of the things are happening. So I think in the end, this becomes the issue of the power balance. So the people who already have lots of money and power, they can do through their private channels interfere the election results or use their networks, and then change the push the certain the candidates in the election situations. And then on the other hand, the who people who don't have that much the private and the personal resources to do that, they are all under surveillance. You can't really do the protest on the street anymore because it can be seen as seen that working for the other governments or the because it's in alignment with the foreign claims. So it's very slippery situation, and then it's further widen the gap of the power between the people and authority.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Midori. Anyone else care to comment before we move on to the next set of questions?
I think, yeah, if I can just add to that, I think Midori raises really important points about who this will be applied against, even though in the parliamentary debates, there was actually proposals that it should be restricted to only bad actor countries, which would be a more obvious way of approaching it, right? And being very clear on what the goal of this is. But that was rejected by government officials for the very basis, that the goal isn't to target particular countries, it's supposed to be country agnostic. But in reality, I think the questions that people are asking today raises those concerns, that very legitimate concerns. Will this be country agnostic? Or will it be used? Who will be investigated? Who will be called out? And I think, again, Senator Wu's point about the EVs and, who raises these points, the suspicion will be cast on people very differently. And depending on what country people may have affiliations to or may have, ancestry from, they'll be facing the brunt of it very differently. And I think it's a really important point that, the way they define a foreign entity for the registry includes foreign economic entities, but they have to have a state affiliation. But it does leave out, the question of private corporations and the influence that they have on Canadian democracy. And so if we're actually serious about talking about, who has influence and untoward influence and outsized influence, we're targeting individuals, communities, but we're not necessarily grasping at the scope of who will be having the biggest impact. And then maybe the last thing is that it's important to note that, for example, the JNF, people have raised that in the questions, that, they're an example of a Canadian charity having influence internationally and interfering, internationally. So working, donating to them wouldn't fall under, Canada's foreign interference laws because it isn't necessarily an interference domestically. On the other hand, one of the things that's come up, and this could apply to the JNF, but also raises other concerns, is that, some of our members are international assistance organizations. They may work with other government and state agencies in order to argue for more funding and better laws to allow for legitimate humanitarian assistance. And they would be forced to register as being under the influence or working in association with a foreign government simply because they're asking for changes to the law to better allow for humanitarian assistance and international development. So there's like, on one hand, the scope of it could include some of the organizations that progressives in Canada are very critical of, but those same laws may also allow the government and national security agencies to also undermine the work of organizations that we're supportive of. And it could also lead to a double standard in how it's being applied. And so I think we have to be very careful around that issue.
Thank you, Tim.
Bianca,
Yes.
if I may jump in and maybe preempt by addressing a question in the chat that you may be coming to by Maria Cheong, who suggests that we are neglecting or not recognizing that there is foreign interference, particularly targeted at diaspora groups. That's not true at all. I've been very clear that the most egregious form of foreign interference that we have to stop is transnational repression. And both Tim and I think, and I'm sure Midori would agree, the best way to deal with that is through the criminal law process. And C-70, in fact, has introduced new laws that target the bullying, threats, coercion, attacks on Canadians that are perpetrated directly or indirectly by a foreign state. That is the way to deal with the problem of transnational repression. There should be no doubt that we are against it. It is wrong, however, I believe it is wrong to try to get at that problem through proxy measures such as a registry or by looking at what your views are. And what is most troubling to me, and this is happening in the public inquiry on foreign interference as we speak, is that the very groups that have been the victims of transnational repression are accusing their fellow Canadians of being spies and agents or proxies because they don't agree with the views of those organizations, because they are not fully aligned with the views of the activist groups. So you have this incredible irony, tragic irony, that groups that are being persecuted, who have the right to demand protection, are accusing other Canadians of being spies and infringing on their human rights, on their freedoms, by making grave, grave allegations against them with zero evidence. And if you're wondering what I'm talking about, look at me. Some of the groups that are witnesses in the public inquiry that have experienced unjustifiable and totally indefensible repression have chosen to call me out and to call individuals in the Vancouver community, organizations in the Vancouver community, to call them out as potential spies for the Chinese government because they're not fully aligned in their views. This is the danger of the national security state that Tim and John and Midori are talking about. It privileges a certain way of thinking and a certain kind of discourse that allows people who may be genuinely affected by repression to then point the fingers at others and create a lot of trouble for them. That's what we call a witch hunt.
So I'm going to go back to our questions because we, in addition to Maria, there are others who have asked about cases of foreign interference. And I think we already have some great suggestions for Senator Wu on how to address this, but I'll just go through some of these in case folks want to comment some more. So Greg says, what are your suggestions for the government to deter foreign interference? Another commentator says C-70 being tabled at Parliament was short, but the discussion on foreign agent registration was not. Without any legal framework, diaspora groups continue to suffer from foreign interference. What kind of legal framework would you propose to effectively tackle foreign interference? And Dimitri says, National Post columnist Adam Zivo just disclosed that he was working for Ukrainian intelligence from early 2022. During that entire time, he was writing pro-NATO articles about the Ukraine war without disclosing that he was working on Ukrainian intelligence. A clear-cut case of foreign interference. So are there any thoughts from our panelists on how to address clear-cut cases of foreign interference?
Well, let me start. Again, C-70 has new laws against transnational repression. I believe these are the most egregious forms of foreign interference that we have to fight. And I hope our law enforcement will be able to use those new laws to stop the repression, the overseas repression of Canadian citizens.
Thank you.
But-
Any other? Oh, please continue.
But just quickly, on election interference, we should pay close attention to what the public inquiry concludes at the end of this year. But so far as I can tell, what they found is that not much happened in the 2019 and 2020 election. And the allegations that there were foreign interference, particularly around Kenny Chiu and Erin O'Toole, simply don't hold water, in my opinion. And so it's very important that we don't change election laws or change procedures to attack a false problem, because that can lead to unintended consequences. That's something for the commissioner to work on in the next couple of months. I hope Canadians will give their input to her, especially Canadians who worry that the response to foreign interference could create more problems, could create stigmatization, discrimination, and the abuse of fundamental rights, and that we should warn against going down that road.
Thank you, Senator Wu. Any other thoughts before we move on to some final questions? We are coming to the end of our time together.
I just like to briefly respond to that question. I like to just remind the people there is a difference between the surveillance activities by the intelligence agency and the criminal justice investigation. It's not the same. So that is why I think the Senator Wu said certain cases, clear cases of the harassment or the the violent any approach by the any governments all over the world can be investigated as the criminal case within the criminal justice system. Then why CSIS wanted to take up the leadership in the system by creating the new system of registry? That's something we have to think about. And then surveillance have never really been successful to prevent any crimes or terrors. We learned that at the high cost in the last 20 years, at the high cost of the largely the Muslim population. They just surveil heavily, and they were extradited, or they are taken away their very basic citizenship under the security certificate system. There are so many human rights violation system. However, this information never really proved to make the Canada safer. No. The south of the border, the same thing. The American state, the United States, has been collecting so much data, like indiscriminately from everybody. Everybody who has the cell phone, computer, all the data are copied, sucked up by that network. And then when Snowden came forth, Obama administration did the investigation, whether the NSA have ever succeeded to prevent the terror. Any cases based on that NSA's illegal mass surveillance activities? Zero, none case they found. And those are not the people, the committee members who did which did the investigation, and not the surveillance researcher like me or anyone who is critical to the system itself. Those are the members of that intelligence community, so-called. So CIA, FBI, these people were not able to find any justifiable cases of using of the data collected by surveillance. So I just doubt, the use of the surveillance can be the solution to any human rights violation issue. I think there is a criminal justice system, and then also we need to go further to change the inequalities and imbalances within the power structure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Midori. So as I said earlier, we're coming to the end of our time together, and yet we have quite a few questions left here. So I think what I'm going to do is there's basically two sets of questions. People are asking about targeted groups, and then, what to do about this situation. And so I'll let you know what people's questions are. And I think in your final statements here, as panelists, you can address any elements of this that you would like to. So in terms of targeted groups, someone asks, what does this bill mean for people who attend or speak at protests in solidarity with Palestine? Or are part of a grassroots organization in solidarity with Palestine? Could they be targeted as being surreptitiously tied to a foreign agent? Someone else asks, what about affiliations with a university in China or Hong Kong? Does such a person who comes back and lectures in Canada have to consider their legal position? And then the final set of questions we have is what to do, Frank asks, can we launch a court challenge against Bill C-70 on the grounds that it's unconstitutional vis-a-vis the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? And another person in the audience asks, what is the next step from here? Again, also asking about the constitutionality of this. What should Canadian civil society do from here? So any thoughts that you have around groups that are specifically being targeted? I know many of you on the panel have already kind of addressed this. And then finally, what to do. So I'll just call on you one at a time. Tim.
Sure. Thanks, Bianca. Yeah, those are two very good questions. In terms of groups being targeted, I think one thing to keep in mind is that there's the registry, and then there's the new laws under the Security of Information Act, and they target slightly groups. They can be used in slightly different ways, so it's important not to conflate the two necessarily. But for example, one of the concerns that we did raise was that we have seen so many baseless accusations of people attending Palestinian solidarity demonstrations and involved in encampments of where are they getting this funding from? Is it coming from Iran? Is it coming from Hamas? Is it coming? And those accusations very well could trigger with some of these new laws, accusations that they're breaking foreign interference laws. And we're worried about the breadth of some, and that, as Senator Wu pointed out, the language of association being used in these laws that is so broad that even if eventually these groups are found, are investigated, maybe charged and acquitted, the allegations are what hang very heavy and that can dissuade people from participating. And so definitely, regardless of whether or not somebody participating in an encampment on a campus could very well be charged with these laws, the fact that they exist and that there's a possibility and that it allows for these questions to be raised could be a serious problem. And I think that goes to the heart also of what are we proposing to as a solution? And it really is a refinement of language, more debate, more investigation, so that it is specifically targeting what's the actual problem, and not opening up, this vague language and vague laws that can be used in, politically expedient or discriminatory ways. And just around next steps, there's a lot of this bill was left to regulation, so that's going to be something for us, and it's hard for the public to get involved, but we're hoping to find ways to open that up and to have these conversations. A new commissioner is going to have to be appointed, and who that person is and what stance they take is going to be very important in terms of how the registry is implemented. So those are some of the ongoing issues that we will have chances to have more input and involve the public in doing that. And it's a little early, but I seriously think that there will be charter challenges to aspects of this bill. It's too early to say exactly how. Some may only come once people are charged. Some may come, preemptively. But I definitely think, and especially the registry, unless the regulations really do tighten up and clarify how it's going to be applied, it seems like it would be rife for a charter challenge.
Thank you, Tim. Midori.
Yes, thank you. Yes, it's really disappointing this Bill C-70 was passed, and then now it becomes the legislation part of the law. And then, once it becomes law, the authorities, they don't really have to show you the evidence of the so-called foreign interference case, or, why they are doing this. They can just, like, for example, university can say, oh, this is now, because of this law, you are not, you are discouraged to work the Chinese scholars, or you have to register yourself with the university if you have the collaboration with the Chinese scholar or Iranian scholar or Russian scholar. They don't really have to explain whether it's true or not. So that is automate the mass surveillance. That part, I'm very disappointed. But at the same time, I think the public can hold this accountable. Yeah, lawsuit is one way. Definitely, there is an unconstitutional aspect of this law. So I think we should challenge that. And then also, intelligence agencies, they don't want to disclose the data because they don't want to lose their sources. That's the main concern for them always. And then often they use the illegal means of data collection, illegal means of surveillance. And then all too often in the criminal court, they can't use those evidence collected by the illegal means. That is why they don't want to be called illegal, for sure. They want to present themselves as a lawful legal agency. That is why I think it is important to keep discussing about the use of the secrecy by the government, if this is appropriate or not. And then if this approach of the intelligence network, using the intelligence agency as the means to resolve any international issues, this effective enough? Is there any evidence really? I think these conversations are very important to continue to point out what's the real, actually, the aim of this new legislation. Frankly, I'm not really sure if this value system, like a traditionally very colonial value system, the intelligence agency uphold, can protect the diaspora people in this country. I'm not talking about the individual agent who work for the LCMP or CSIS. I'm not talking about the individual value system. I'm talking about the collective value system CSIS has been upholding. If you have read this book ever, The Change of the Agent, this is written by the Muslim women who used to work for CSIS as the investigative officer. And then I invited her, the Huda Makbil, the author, last year to my class, as well as for the public talk here. And then as far as I learned from her talk, as well as the book, the core of the intelligence agency's value is very colonial. So then it's basically, frankly, it's racist and sexist. And how this the group can protect the individual human rights for the diaspora communities, I question that. So that's something I haven't really seen as the evidence. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ogasawara. John.
Thanks very much, Bianca, and thank you to all our panelists. I'm not going to add any further comments at this point, but just to say that I think that the webinar has served its purpose. We've laid out a lot of issues, gotten some very important information that I think will help us in moving forward. So thank you, Bianca, for moderating the session, and to all the panelists for their fabulous contributions.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Senator Wu?
Well, John and Midori and Tim have done a great job talking about the way forward. It's going to be rocky, dangerous, and fraught. And it's because, and that's the reason for that is because parliamentarians dropped the ball. It's really embarrassing The way forward, I think will have to involve a lot of scrutiny about the regulations that are put in place, the appointment of the commissioner, and how the commissioner chooses to define the language that is in the law, particularly the definition of in association. We have to make sure that the commission does not take an overly broad definition that's going to stigmatize and create problems for Canadians. I would also say that there's a review of the legislation, a mandated review in 5 years, so 2029. So parliamentarians will have a chance to take a look at this again. This is where civil society will have to do its job to let their elected representatives and their senators know that they messed it up the first time around. And when they have a second chance in 2029, they need to fix the problems. In the meantime, yes, this is clearly unconstitutional. There could be court challenges, but these are expensive and these are painful for the people who have to go through it. So I have to conclude on a sad and pessimistic note, which is to say that I think many people are going to get hurt before we can see a better outcome for the way we deal with foreign interference and counter espionage and those sorts of issues.
All right, a sobering note to end on, but I want to thank all of our panelists for your insightful contributions today. I think it goes without saying that your expertise has been really invaluable in illuminating the threats posed by this bill C-70 to civil liberties, the potential for a witch hunt, the chill on civic engagement. So thank you for helping us to navigate it, this alarming legislation, and also for your call to challenge it and the many problematic, dangerous, likely unconstitutional elements that we've heard about this afternoon moving forward. And to everyone at home, I would say, please do continue to stay informed, stay engaged on this issue. Please share this event. It'll be on Facebook and on YouTube. Please do help us we need more people to be talking about this. And finally, please do join CCF next week for our next event, 100% tariffs on China's EVs. Is this Canada's just transition, with Elizabeth May, co-leader of the Green Party, and author Sam Gindin, which is on the 19th at 7 p.m. So it's been a great event. Thanks to Rochelle also behind the scenes. Thanks to University of Victoria Centre for Global Studies, CFPI, the team at CCF, and of course, thanks to our brilliant panelists, Tim, John, Midori, Senator Wu. Thanks to you, really an inspiration. We've learned so much. Goodbye to all.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.